The world is dying. Across the Roman Empire, the fields turn barren, the wheat withers on the stalk, and a chilling frost settles over lands that have only ever known the sun. It's a cataclysmic winter, one that has no end in sight, and the cause is not a natural disaster or a war between men. It's the grief of a single mother, a grief so powerful it is starving humanity into extinction. This is the story of that grief. It's the story of a kidnapping that shattered the world, of a love that bloomed in the darkest place imaginable, and of a bargain that would forever divide our year into light and shadow. We all know the Greek version, Hades and Persephone, but the Roman telling, the story of Pluto and Proserpina, is darker, more political, and holds a terrifying secret at its core. Because what if the most infamous abduction in mythology wasn't just a crime of passion? What if it was the first move in a cosmic chess match, a calculated strike against the most powerful goddess on Earth? And what if the young woman at the center of it all, Proserpina, wasn't just a victim, but a living weapon she never knew she was? To understand how the world was broken, you first have to understand the paradise that was lost. Imagine a world of perpetual spring. This was the domain of Ceres, goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and motherly love. She was not some minor deity of flowers and fields. Ceres was one of the original 6 children of Saturn, a sister to Jupiter, the king of the gods, and to Neptune, ruler of the seas. Her power was absolute, fundamental. While her brothers ruled the skies and the oceans, Ceres commanded the very earth itself. She decided which seeds would sprout, which fruits would ripen, which grains would rise to feed the burgeoning Roman world. The legions marched on the wheat she provided. The empire was built on the abundance she granted. Her favor was the difference between prosperity and famine, between life and death for every mortal on the planet. And all of this immense world-sustaining power was focused on a single point of affection: her daughter Proserpina. Proserpina was the embodiment of spring. She was joy and innocence personified, spending her days in the sun-drenched fields of Sicily, weaving garlands with nymphs, her laughter carrying on the warm breeze. She was sheltered, protected, and adored. Her mother Ceres had ensured her life was a perfect, unbroken paradise, a world away from the violent politics and cruel whims of the other gods on Mount Olympus. Proserpina knew nothing of darkness, of sorrow, or of fear. She was the singular, cherished child of the most nurturing goddess in the pantheon. But in protecting her daughter so fiercely, Ceres had made a grave miscalculation. She had created the perfect target. Far below this world of light and life, in the silent, sunless depths, ruled another of Saturn's children, Pluto, the forgotten brother. When the 3 brothers divided the universe, Jupiter took the glorious heavens, Neptune the churning seas, and Pluto was given the underworld, the realm of the dead. It was a kingdom of immense wealth, filled with all the gold, silver, and precious gems hidden within the earth. It was a realm of perfect order, where the shades of the departed were judged and assigned their final resting place. But it was a kingdom of dust and shadows, a place of eternal twilight, devoid of warmth, color, or companionship. Pluto was not a monster. He was not the Roman equivalent of a devil. He was a king, a just, solemn, and powerful ruler who performed a vital cosmic duty. But he was utterly, crushingly alone. No goddess would share his dark throne. No laughter ever echoed in his vast, silent halls. He was the wealthiest of the gods, and the most isolated. And this isolation, this pocket of the universe untouched by love, represented a glaring flaw in the system. A challenge. This challenge was noticed by the one goddess whose entire domain was built on connection: Venus, the goddess of love. From her golden throne, she watched the cosmos, her influence spreading through every realm. She had ensnared gods, mortals, and beasts alike. Jupiter, the mighty king, had countless affairs under her influence. Neptune's passion stirred the seas. Even Mars, the god of war, laid down his sword for her. Every corner of the universe, from the highest heavens to the deepest oceans, bent to her power. Every corner except one. Pluto's cold, loveless heart was an insult to her authority. His indifference was a territory she had yet to conquer, and so she decided to act. This wasn't about finding a companion for a lonely god. This was a power play. She summoned her son, the winged archer Cupid, whose arrows could inflict a love more potent and inescapable than any poison. She pointed down, through the crust of the very earth, toward the silent, brooding king of the underworld. And then she pointed toward the sunlit fields of Sicily, to the one person whose abduction would cause the most chaos, the one whose disappearance would wound another major god most deeply. Proserpina. The plan was diabolically simple. Cupid was to strike Pluto with his sharpest golden arrow, the kind that ignites an obsessive, all-consuming love that cannot be denied. The target of this affection was to be the first unmarried woman Pluto laid eyes on, and Venus would ensure that woman would be the daughter of Ceres. It was an act of cosmic vandalism designed to prove a point: that love, her power, was superior to all others. It was more powerful than a mother's protection, more powerful than a king's isolation, and more powerful even than the fundamental laws that govern the living and the dead. Venus wasn't just trying to start a romance. She was lighting a fuse on a bomb, and at the center of that explosion was Proserpina. The young goddess, at that very moment, was wandering through the fields of henna, drawn to a patch of narcissus flowers so uniquely beautiful they seemed to glow with an inner light. She was completely unaware of the divine conspiracy unfolding miles above her head and miles below her feet. She did not know that the king of the dead, a god she had never met, whose name she may not have even known, was about to be struck by an arrow of pure obsession. She did not know that her mother's perfect world was about to be turned into a frozen hell. And she did not know that the flower she was reaching for was not just a flower, but a lure, a bait placed there to hold her in place, just long enough for the earth to split open beneath her feet. And split it did, not with a gentle crack, but with a deafening bone-jarring roar that ripped through the idyllic peace of the meadow. The ground beneath Proserpina's feet didn't just tremble, it convulsed. It tore apart like fabric, a violent, gaping wound opening into the planet's secret heart. From this chasm, a darkness deeper than any night spilled out, a cold that had never known the sun, and a scent of ancient stone and decay. Her friends screamed, scattering like frightened birds, their joyous laughter replaced by shrieks of pure terror. But Proserpina was frozen, not by fear, though it was a cold serpent coiling in her gut, but by awe. From the abyss, four colossal black stallions thundered into the light, their eyes burning like embers, their breath pluming like smoke in the Sicilian air. They were creatures of nightmare, magnificent and horrifying, their hooves striking sparks against the torn earth. Behind them, gripping the reins of a chariot carved from obsidian and shadow, was a figure of terrible majesty. He was not a monster. He was a god. His face was stern, handsome in a severe, unforgiving way, framed by a beard as dark as the void from which he'd come. His eyes held the weight of millennia, the sorrow of every soul that had ever passed from the world of light. This was Pluto, lord of the underworld, king of the dead, and he had come for his queen. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His intent was a physical force, a tidal wave of will that crashed over the meadow. The chariot thundered towards her, and in a single fluid motion that was both brutal and strangely graceful, he leaned down, an arm like iron banded around her waist, lifting her from the ground as if she were no heavier than the flowers she had been gathering. The shock was so profound she couldn't even scream. One moment, her fingers were inches from a narcissus petal. The next, the world was a blur of green and blue as she was hoisted into the air. The cold of his armor seeped through her thin dress, a chilling contrast to the sun on her skin just seconds before. She was pressed against a chest that felt as unyielding as a mountain. Her basket of flowers tumbled, scattering a vibrant, pathetic rainbow across the ruined grass. Then her voice returned. A scream tore from her throat, raw and desperate. A name. Mother. Ceres. Mother. It was a child's cry, a plea to the most powerful force she knew. But her mother was far away, overseeing the harvests of some distant land, deaf to the sound of her daughter's world ending. Pluto gave the reins a sharp crack. The nightmare horses reared, their powerful legs churning the air, and then they plunged back towards the chasm. The descent was dizzying, a gut-wrenching fall into absolute blackness. The warm sunlit air was ripped away, replaced by a damp, subterranean cold that smelled of wet rock and something else, something metallic and sorrowful like old tears. Proserpina fought. She twisted and struggled against his grip, but it was like fighting against a statue. He held her fast, his silence more terrifying than any threat. The roar of their passage through the earth was all-consuming, a grinding, shrieking symphony of rock and soil being torn asunder. They were moving at an impossible speed, not through a tunnel, but through the very substance of the world itself, which parted before them and sealed behind them, erasing their path, erasing any hope of rescue. After an eternity of falling through darkness, the chariot broke through into a vast, cavernous space. The only light came from the phosphorescent glow of strange mosses clinging to the ceiling miles above, and the faint, shimmering haze of the rivers that crisscrossed this desolate landscape. This was his kingdom, the Underworld. The chariot sped on, its wheels silent now on the dusty, lifeless ground. They followed the course of a sluggish, murky river, and as they traveled, Proserpina began to see them. Figures. Faint, translucent shapes drifting through the gloom. The shades of the dead, their faces blank with resignation, their movements slow and purposeless. They turned their hollow eyes towards the thundering chariot, a flicker of something: surprise? Confusion? In their spectral forms before they faded back into the oppressive twilight. This was a world without color, without joy, without life. The full horror of her situation began to dawn on her. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. This wasn't a temporary capture. This was a relocation. This god of darkness had brought her to his home, a place from which no living thing had ever returned. Her struggles ceased. A cold, hard dread settled in her stomach, heavier than any stone. She watched the bleak landscape roll by, her mind racing. Who was this god? Why had he chosen her? What did he want? Her cries for her mother died in her throat, useless in a realm that had never known a mother's love. But her journey was not without witness. As the chariot approached a wide, crystalline pool of water, its path was suddenly blocked. A figure rose from the center of the pool, a nymph of breathtaking beauty, her body formed of the clear water itself. It was Cyane, the spirit of that spring, and a childhood friend of Proserpina. Stop! Her voice was not a shout, but a command that echoed with the ancient power of the water she embodied. You will go no further, Lord of Shades. You cannot take her. She is a daughter of the living world, of the sun and the sky. She does not belong to you. Cyane stood her ground, her watery form shimmering with defiance. She looked at Proserpina, held captive in the dark god's grip, and her expression was one of fierce, protective love. By force you may be a mighty suitor, Pluto, but you are not a worthy one. You should have asked her mother. You should have wooed her with gifts and pleas, not with terror and violence. I forbid you to pass. For the first time, Pluto's cold composure seemed to crack. A flicker of rage, hot and dangerous, ignited in his deep-set eyes. Who was this minor spirit to challenge him? To lecture him on courtship? He who held dominion over legions of the dead, who commanded the wealth of the earth, who answered to no one but his brother Jupiter. He did not deign to answer her with words. His response was one of pure, unrestrained power. He tightened his grip on Proserpina, pulled back his royal scepter, a two-pronged bident that seemed to drink the very light from the air, and with a roar of fury, he struck the basin of the spring. The impact was catastrophic. The earth groaned and the clear waters of the pool exploded upwards. A wave of force, black and negative, radiated from the point of impact. When the water settled, Cyane was gone. The nymph hadn't just been pushed aside or injured. Her very essence had been violated. The shock of Pluto's divine rage, combined with her grief at seeing her friend stolen away, was too much for her to bear. She dissolved. Her watery limbs melted away, her consciousness dissipating into the pool she once commanded. Her bones softened into the riverbed. Her hair became the weeds. All that was left of the brave nymph was the spring itself, now silent and still. She became a pool of tears, a permanent liquid monument to her own sorrow. But even as she faded, a final act of defiance remained. Proserpina's girdle, a sash woven by her own hands, had come loose in the struggle. Cyane's last, fading consciousness guided it, letting it float upon the surface of the water. A clue, a sign for anyone who might come looking, a message for a grieving mother. Pluto gave the dissolving spring a final, contemptuous glance and cracked the reins once more. The chariot lurched forward, crossing the now unprotected waters and plunging deeper into the gloom. Proserpina had watched the entire exchange in silent horror. The one creature in this whole terrifying realm who had tried to help her, who had shown her kindness, had been annihilated for it. Erased. The message was clear. Here Pluto's will was absolute. Here there was no defiance. There was no hope. The last embers of her fighting spirit died out, replaced by a chilling understanding. She was utterly, completely alone, a prisoner in a kingdom of ghosts, at the mercy of a silent, wrathful god who had just demonstrated the terrifying finality of his power. The chariot rolled on, deeper and deeper into the endless night, carrying the new, unwilling queen to the very heart of the land of the dead. The air grew thin, cold, and heavy, tasting of damp earth and something ancient, like dust from a tomb stirred for the first time in 1,000 years. The brilliant, chaotic colors of the sunlit world bled away, replaced by an infinite gradient of shadow. Proserpina, her tears now frozen to her cheeks, could only watch as the last sliver of the world she knew, a jagged crack of angry red twilight, was sealed shut by tons of rock and soil above them. The sound wasn't a crash but a deep final groan, the sound of a door closing that would never open again. And then, there was only the rumble of the chariot wheels and the rhythmic, powerful stomping of the immortal horses. Pluto had not spoken a word. He drove the chariot with a grim, focused intensity, his grip on the reins like iron. He was no longer just an aggressor. He was a king returning to his kingdom, and she was his prize, his conquest. Every jolt of the chariot was a reminder of her powerlessness, a punctuation mark in a sentence of absolute despair. She was falling away from everything she had ever loved, away from the warmth of the sun, the scent of her mother's gardens, the laughter of her friends. She was falling into a place that wasn't meant for the living. The darkness was not empty. As her eyes adjusted, she began to see that it was a living, breathing entity. Shades and spirits, thin as smoke and twice as silent, flitted at the edges of the path. They were drawn to the strange, vibrant life force she radiated, like moths to a dying flame. They had no faces, only the vague impression of sorrow, of longing, of memories worn smooth by eternity. They reached out with vaporous hands, their silent mouths forming questions she could not hear. Who was she? Why did she still possess the warmth of blood, the light of a soul not yet judged? Pluto ignored them. To him, they were as common as trees in a forest, the silent, ever-present subjects of his domain. Soon the sound of the chariot was joined by another, a low, sluggish murmur, the sound of a great slow-moving river. They had arrived at the first and most famous border of the underworld, the river Styx. It wasn't water that flowed in its channel but liquid despair. The black, oily surface reflected no light, seeming to swallow the very essence of it. On the far bank, a line of souls stretched back into the gloom, a silent, patient queue waiting for passage. And poling a battered skiff across the viscous current was a figure as grim and ancient as the river itself. Charon, the ferryman of the dead. His eyes, sunk deep in a weathered face, glowed with a faint, resentful light. He looked at Pluto's chariot, at the immortal horses that needed no boat, and at the living girl seated beside the god, and he gave a slow, creaking nod of acknowledgement. He knew better than to question his king. Proserpina watched the souls on the bank. She saw an old man fumbling for a coin, his spectral hands passing right through the pouch he thought he still wore. She saw a young warrior, his ethereal form still riddled with the wounds that had killed him, staring blankly at the water. Each of them needed a coin, an obol, placed in their mouth upon death to pay the ferryman. Without it, they were doomed to wander the banks for 100 years. This was the first law of this land, a cold, transactional reality that stripped away all worldly status, leaving only the final price of passage. This kingdom had rules, ancient and unbreakable. Once across the Styx, the landscape opened into a vast gray plain under a starless, perpetually twilit sky. This was the fields of Asphodel, the destination for the vast majority of souls, those who had been neither particularly virtuous nor exceptionally wicked. They drifted aimlessly through the pale, ghostly asphodel flowers, whispering of half-forgotten lives. Their passions and ambitions faded to a dull, eternal ache of what once was. It was a place of profound, unending melancholy, a purgatory of sheer, soul-crushing boredom. But then a terrible guttural barking echoed across the plains, a sound that vibrated deep in Proserpina's bones. The sound came from a beast of impossible scale. Standing guard at a massive gate of black iron was Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. Each head was the size of a boulder, with teeth like sharpened daggers. A mane of writhing snakes hissed and spat from its necks, and its 6 eyes burned with a malevolent, sleepless fire. The souls of the dead cowered before it, for Cerberus was the ultimate warden. He let all enter but none leave. As the chariot approached, the beast's 3 heads ceased their barking and focused on the new arrival. A low growl like the grinding of tectonic plates, rumbled from its 3 chests. Proserpina shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was a nightmare given flesh and fang. But Pluto simply raised a hand. He didn't shout, he didn't command. He made a simple, familiar gesture. And the monster, the terror of the underworld, whined. All 3 heads lowered in submission. One of them even nudged against Pluto's outstretched hand, its brutish affection a shocking contrast to its horrifying form. The god of the dead scratched the beast behind one of its massive ears, and a wave of pleasure rippled through its monstrous body. Cerberus was not just a monster. He was a loyal guardian, a pet, and he knew his master had come home. He gave Proserpina a final, suspicious sniff with one of his wet, cavernous nostrils before stepping aside, allowing the chariot to pass through the gates. Beyond the gate, the path diverged. To the left, a dark, descending road led toward a chasm from which faint screams and the smell of burning sulfur seemed to rise. Tartarus, the pit of eternal punishment for the truly wicked, for the titans and the greatest sinners against the gods. To the right, a soft golden light seemed to emanate from a distant grove. Elysium, the Isles of the Blessed, a paradise for heroes and the virtuous, a place of peace and gentle joy that was the underworld's greatest secret. Pluto guided the chariot straight ahead, down the central path. He was showing her everything, not just the horror but the entire scope of his realm. This was not just a prison. It was a nation, an empire of the departed with its own geography, its own laws, its own tiered society. He reigned over the silent majority in Asphodel, he administered justice to those in Tartarus, and he provided reward to the heroes in Elysium. He was not merely a captor, he was a king. And for the first time, a sliver of understanding, cold and sharp, pierced Proserpina's fear. He hadn't just stolen a bride. He had brought a queen to her new kingdom. The path began to climb, and ahead, looming out of the oppressive gloom, was a structure that defied imagination. A palace. It wasn't built of marble or gold, but of polished black obsidian that seemed to drink the very light from the air. Towers like jagged shards of night scraped the unseen ceiling of the great cavern. Jewels glittered in its walls, but they were not diamonds or rubies. They were veins of silver, gold, and precious metals, raw and untamed, gleaming with the cold, internal fire of the Earth's core. This was where all the wealth of the world eventually ended up. It was a place of staggering, lifeless opulence, a monument to power and permanence. A silent, formidable fortress built to house the sorrows of the world. The chariot slowed, the hoofs of the black horses falling silent as they came to a stop before a pair of immense, silver-chased doors. The journey was over. The descent was complete. Pluto finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He had shown her the borders, the citizens, and the sheer, terrifying scale of his dominion. And now he had brought her here, to the very heart of it all, to his home. And as the great doors began to swing open with a low, resonant groan to hers, the air that met her was not the damp, foul air of a tomb, but something else entirely. It was cool, still, and carried the scent of deep earth, of wet stone, and a faint metallic tang like a storm just before it breaks. The silence inside was different, too. Not the absence of sound, but a presence. A heavy, ancient quiet that seemed to absorb all noise, all thought. Before her stretched a hall so vast it seemed to defy the very rock that contained it. The floor was a single, unbroken sheet of obsidian, polished to such a perfect mirror that it reflected a sky of its own, a vaulted ceiling impossibly high above, where veins of silver and gold crisscrossed through the black stone like constellations in a midnight universe. There were no torches, no fires, yet the hall was bathed in a cold, ethereal light. It emanated from the walls themselves, where colossal uncut diamonds and fist-sized rubies were embedded, pulsing with a soft, internal luminescence. This wasn't a cave. It was a palace carved from the very treasury of the earth. Pluto led her forward, his steps making no sound on the glassy floor. Her own sandals, still dusted with the soil of Sicily, seemed to profane the perfect, sterile surface. As they walked, figures emerged from the shadows along the walls. They were the servants of the palace, shades of long-dead mortals bound to service. They moved with a silent, weightless grace, their forms indistinct, their faces blank canvases of sorrow and memory. They bowed as their king passed, 100 heads lowering in a single, synchronized, soundless motion. Proserpina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. This was a kingdom of ghosts, and she was the only living thing in it. They passed through archways carved from solid blocks of lapis lazuli and malachite. Great tapestries hung on the walls, woven not from wool or silk, but from something that shimmered like captured moonlight. They didn't depict hunts or festive celebrations like the tapestries in the halls of Olympus. They showed the 5 great rivers of the underworld, the endless gray expanse of the fields of Asphodel, and the tormented fiery pits of Tartarus. It was a complete and unflinching portrait of his kingdom, a declaration of his power and his burden. Finally, they entered the heart of the palace, the throne room. Here the scale was even more immense. The obsidian floor stretched out towards a raised dais, upon which sat not 1 but 2 thrones. The first was his. It was carved from a single massive piece of Stygian iron, blacker than any shadow, its surface seeming to drink the light from the room. It was a seat of absolute, unyielding authority, but it was the second throne that held her gaze. It stood beside his, equal in stature, but crafted from a luminous, pale silver that seemed to glow from within. Its back was intricately carved with the shapes of sleeping poppies and barren winter branches, and it was inlaid with mother-of-pearl and shimmering moonstones. It was stark and cold and breathtakingly beautiful, and it was empty. Pluto stopped before the dais and turned to her. He didn't gesture to the throne, not yet. His expression was impossible to read, a mask of regal calm. "This is my home," he said, his voice the low rumble of shifting tectonic plates. It didn't echo in the vast space. The silence simply swallowed it. "The seat of my power. From here I govern the inevitable. I am the final destination for every king, every hero, every farmer, every poet. I am the great balance to the chaos of life you know above." Proserpina found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. "This is a prison." A flicker of something, was it disappointment? Sadness? Crossed his features for a fraction of a second. A prison is a place for the unwilling. A kingdom is a place for a ruler. He looked from her to the silver throne. The implication hung in the air, heavier than the stone ceiling above them. He saw her not as a captive but as a consort, a queen. The thought was so audacious, so terrifying it stole her breath. She, a goddess of flowers and sunshine, a queen of this silent, glittering, endless night? She shook her head, a small, defiant gesture. "I am not your queen. I am the daughter of Ceres. I belong in the sun, in the fields of grain. You belong where your power is needed," Pluto countered, his voice even, patient. "Your mother gives life, a noble but incomplete task. Life that is never-ending becomes a curse. A field that is never harvested rots. I provide the harvest. I provide the winter that allows for the spring. We are 2 halves of the same eternal truth." As he spoke, a long table of polished basalt rose silently from the floor nearby. Upon it an impossible feast appeared. There were platters of dark, glistening meats of beasts she could not name, bowls filled with fruits the color of bruises and midnight, black cherries, deep purple figs, pomegranates with skin like polished garnet. Goblets of silver were filled with a wine so dark it looked like ink. The aroma was intoxicating, rich and heavy with the scent of minerals and exotic spices. "You are weary from your journey," Pluto said, his tone softening slightly. "You must eat." Proserpina stared at the food. Her stomach ached with a hunger she hadn't realized was there. The journey through the earth had been long and terrifying. She hadn't eaten since she'd been picking flowers in the meadow, a lifetime ago. The food looked decadent, tempting. It was a king's feast, an offering of hospitality, but she knew with a primal instinct that screamed through her veins that it was also a trap. To eat the food of this place, to partake in its bounty, would be to bind herself to it. It was a chain forged of courtesy, a cage built of sustenance. "I will not eat," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a surge of defiant fear. "I will not drink. I will not touch a single thing in this dead land until you return me to my mother." Pluto regarded her for a long moment. He didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even of respect. "The gods of the upper world," he began, his voice laced with a weariness that seemed older than the mountains. "They feast and they fight. They meddle in the lives of mortals for sport. They love with the passion of a summer fire, and they hate with the fury of a winter storm. It is all loud." He gestured to the silent hall around them. "Here there is purpose. Every soul that arrives has a story that is finished. My task is not to judge them, but to give them their place in eternity. It is a sacred, silent, and solitary duty." He took a step closer, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "I have watched you, Proserpina. I have seen the life that burns within you, so bright it could outshine the gems of my vaults. I did not bring you here to extinguish that light. I brought you here because my kingdom of shadow has need of it, has need of you. This throne is not a cage. It is an offer of power you cannot imagine. The queen of the underworld is not a prisoner. She is the mistress of secrets, the keeper of final rest, the other half of existence itself." He fell silent, letting his words settle in the profound quiet. Proserpina stood frozen, caught between terror and a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else. Awe, the sheer, crushing scale of his domain, the absolute nature of his power, the lonely gravity of his duty. He wasn't just a monster who had stolen her from a field. He was a monarch of a realm as essential as the sky, and he wasn't offering her a cell. He was offering her half of it. Her gaze drifted from his intense face back to the feast. A single perfect pomegranate sat on a silver plate, its skin gleaming in the cold light. It seemed to call to her, a promise of sweetness in this desolate place. Her hunger was a physical pain now, a gnawing emptiness. Her defiance was a shield, but it was growing heavy. She was so very, very tired, and so very, very hungry. She reached out a trembling hand. The pomegranate felt heavy, impossibly real in a world of shades and echoes. Its skin was like cool leather, its deep crimson color a stark rebellion against the endless gray. She broke it open. The sound was a soft, wet crack that seemed to echo in the profound silence of the chamber. Inside, the seeds were clustered together like jewels, each one a perfect, glistening ruby, catching the faint light and throwing it back 100-fold. They were impossibly beautiful. They were life itself. Her resolve, once a mighty fortress, was now nothing more than sandcastles against a rising tide. One seed. Just one. What harm could a single seed do? It was so small, so insignificant. A tiny taste to quiet the screaming emptiness inside her. She lifted a single perfect arrow to her lips. It was cool against her skin. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she wasn't in the underworld. She was back in the sun-drenched fields of Sicily, the taste of sweet things on her tongue, the warmth of the sun on her face. She placed the seed in her mouth. An explosion of flavor. It was a taste more intense than anything she had ever known. It was the sweetness of 1,000 summer berries, the tartness of the first spring apple, the deep, rich flavor of wine aged for a century. It was everything she had been deprived of, everything she missed, concentrated into one tiny, perfect moment. The juice burst against her tongue, a flood of relief that washed away the hunger, the fear, the loneliness. In that instant, there was only the sublime, overwhelming taste of life. She took another, and then another. She couldn't stop. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was a desperate, primal need. She devoured 6 of the seeds, each one a punctuation mark in her surrender, each one a nail in the coffin of her old life. The sweet juice ran down her chin, staining her pale skin like a drop of blood. And as the last of the 6 seeds was swallowed, a profound stillness fell over her. The gnawing hunger was gone, but in its place a new feeling began to bloom. A cold, heavy certainty. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. Pluto was standing in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed not on her, but on the broken pomegranate in her hands. There was no anger in his expression, no gloating triumph. There was only a quiet, unreadable finality, as if he were a master craftsman observing the final, perfect click of a complex machine he had set in motion long ago. "It is done," he said, his voice a low rumble that was not a question but a statement of fact. Proserpina stared at him, confused. Done? What was done? She had eaten a piece of fruit, but then she felt it. A change, a subtle shift in the very fabric of her being. It was as if a fine, invisible thread had unspooled from the fruit and woven itself into her soul, anchoring her to the bedrock of this dark kingdom. The air of the underworld no longer felt foreign and oppressive, felt familiar. The chill in her bones lessened, replaced by a strange resonance with the cold stone and the silent rivers. She had heard the old laws, the ancient rules whispered by nymphs in hushed tones as warnings. The immutable law of the fates, older than the gods themselves. Anyone, mortal or divine, who partakes of the food or drink of the underworld, is bound to it for all time. they become part of the realm, their essence forever tied to its soil. It was a rule so absolute, so fundamental, that not even Jupiter himself could undo it. The sweetness on her tongue turned to ash. The relief in her stomach curdled into a knot of pure dread. She looked down at her hands, at the crimson stains on her fingers, and saw not the juice of a fruit, but the ink of a contract she had just signed in blissful, starving ignorance. The trap had never been the locked doors or the silent guards. The trap had been her own body, her own need. Pluto hadn't needed to conquer her with force. He had simply waited for her to conquer herself. He had offered her a choice, knowing that hunger and despair would eventually make the choice for her. It was a victory of patience, a conquest of psychology. While Proserpina was sealing her fate in the silent depths, the world above was screaming. Her mother Ceres had long since passed from grief into a cold, unyielding rage. Her sorrow was no longer a private burden. It had become a weapon she wielded against the entire world. She walked the earth, and the earth died beneath her feet. The green fields of Sicily, once her greatest joy, became barren plains of dust. The vibrant, golden wheat that was her gift to mankind withered on the stalk, turning black and brittle. Rivers and streams that once teemed with life slowed to a trickle, their water turning brackish and foul. The leaves on the trees curled and dropped, leaving behind skeletal branches that clawed at a pale, merciless sky. The sun still rose, but it gave no warmth. It was a distant, indifferent eye in the heavens, looking down on a world freezing to death. The animals starved. The birds fell silent. Mankind, huddled in their homes, watched their stores of grain dwindle to nothing. They prayed to Ceres, the bringer of bounty, but their prayers were met with a stony, unforgiving silence. They prayed to the other gods, to Jupiter, begging for relief. Their desperate pleas rose to Olympus like a column of smoke, thick with fear and starvation. On his golden throne, Jupiter could ignore it no longer. The balance of the cosmos was tipping into chaos. The mortals, whose worship and belief gave the gods their power, were perishing. His own sister Ceres was holding the entire planet hostage to her grief. He had allowed his brother Pluto his prize, hoping the affair would resolve itself, that Ceres' anger would cool with time. He had underestimated the depths of a mother's love, and the terrifying power of her rage. He looked down from his celestial perch and saw not a thriving world, but a dying one. He saw the work of generations, the careful cultivation of civilization, crumbling into dust because of one goddess's broken heart. This could not stand. It was an affront to the divine order he was sworn to uphold. His hand was forced. He called for Mercury, the fleet-footed messenger of the gods, his winged sandals already humming with latent speed. Jupiter's face was grim, his brow furrowed with the weight of the command he was about to give. The time for quiet diplomacy and patient waiting was over. An ultimatum had to be delivered. "Go to the Underworld," Jupiter's voice boomed, echoing through the halls of Olympus. "Find my brother Pluto. Tell him this winter will not end. Tell him the mortals will perish, and the very foundations of our power will crumble to dust, unless he releases the daughter of Ceres. Tell him Proserpina must be returned." Mercury bowed, his expression serious. He understood the gravity of the mission. This was not a simple message. It was a challenge. It was the king of Olympus issuing a decree to the king of the Underworld. It was a clash of dominions, a confrontation between two of the three most powerful beings in existence, with the fate of a goddess and the world itself hanging in the balance. With a flash of golden light, Mercury was gone, streaking through the cosmos. A bolt of divine will aimed directly at the heart of the dark kingdom below. He was descending into a realm where the laws of Olympus held little sway, to deliver a command to a god who had never once bent his knee to his brother in the sky. He was flying toward a king who, in his own mind, had already won. The messenger god cut through the gloom, his winged sandals beating against an air thick with silence and finality. This was not the thin, breathable sky of the mortal world. This air was heavy, weighted with the dust of ages and the echoes of every life ever lived. As he descended, the familiar light of the sun was extinguished, replaced by a cold, phosphorescent glow emanating from the strange fungi and minerals that clung to the cavern walls. He passed over the river Styx, a slick, black oil slick of a river, where the boatman Charon pulled his silent ferry, his passengers the pale, whispering shades of the newly dead. They looked up as Mercury passed, their empty eyes following the brief flash of gold from his helmet, a memory of a world they had lost forever. At the gates of the kingdom, the great three-headed hound Cerberus stirred. But this was no mindless beast. Each head turned, its eyes glowing with intelligence, recognizing the sigil of Olympus on the messenger's staff. It gave a low rumble, not of aggression but of acknowledgement. A diplomat with the correct credentials. He was permitted to pass. The sheer oppressive order of the realm was staggering. Above on Olympus, gods bickered, storms raged, and passions ruled the day. Here there was only the vast, silent, and meticulous administration of eternity. Pluto didn't rule through fear, but through certainty. The one certainty every mortal, and even every god, had to face. Mercury finally reached the heart of the underworld. A vast, vaulted cavern so large it could have swallowed a mountain range. And there, upon a throne of polished obsidian, sat the king. Pluto was not a monster wreathed in flame. He was regal, somber, his dark eyes holding the wisdom and sorrow of millennia. He was a god in his absolute prime, radiating a power that was different from Jupiter's crackling energy. It was the power of gravity, the power of inevitability. And beside him, on a slightly smaller but no less ornate throne, sat Proserpina. She had changed. The terror that had defined her abduction was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. She wore robes of the deepest purple, embroidered with silver stars, and a crown of black diamonds rested on her head. She was no longer just the daughter of Ceres, she was a queen. She looked up as Mercury entered, and for a moment, her mask of regal composure slipped. Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope, of confusion, of a life she thought was lost forever, returning to her face. Mercury did not waste time with pleasantries. In this kingdom, they were a frivolous currency. He stood before the throne, staff in hand, and delivered his message. He spoke of the world above, of a land dying under the grief of a mother. He spoke of the barren fields, the starving mortals, the prayers that went unanswered. He spoke of the imbalance, the disruption to the cosmic order. And then he delivered the core of the message, the command from Jupiter, the king of the gods. Proserpina must be returned. It was an ultimatum wrapped in the language of a request. An absolute silence descended upon the throne room. Pluto's face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply listened, his gaze fixed on the messenger. He had known this was coming. He had known his brief season of happiness was built on borrowed time. But to hear it spoken aloud, to have his brother's command delivered to his own court, was a profound insult. It was a reminder that for all his power, for all his dominion, the world of light and life still held sway. Proserpina looked at him, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The thought of seeing her mother, of feeling the sun on her skin again, was an intoxicating relief. But she also looked at the god beside her, the silent, brooding king who had, against all odds, shown her a strange and solemn kindness. He had shared his power with her, made her his equal, and treated her not as a prisoner but as a consort. Pluto finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cavern. He spoke not to Mercury but to Proserpina. He told her that the command had come from on high, that her mother's grief was withering the world. He said, "I cannot hold you against the will of Jupiter. If you wish to leave, the way is open." His words were simple, direct, a full concession. Mercury was stunned. He had expected a fight, a negotiation, a war of wills that could tear the cosmos apart. But this was surrender. Proserpina was torn. It was everything she had prayed for, yet it felt like a betrayal. To simply stand up and walk away from this vast, silent kingdom and the god who ruled it, it felt wrong. She had become part of this place. The shades knew her as their queen. The very darkness seemed to bend to her will. Then Pluto did something clever, something that would change the fate of the world forever. He rose from his throne and gestured to a nearby table, upon which sat a simple silver platter. On it was a single, perfect pomegranate, its skin the color of a deep sunset, split open to reveal the glistening jewel-like seeds within. "You must be hungry," he said to her, his voice soft, almost gentle. "It has been a long journey, and you have eaten nothing. Before you return to the world above, you should have some refreshment. It is the law of hospitality." It seemed like such a small gesture, an act of kindness before a final farewell. Mercury saw no harm in it. Proserpina, feeling a strange mix of guilt and gratitude, saw only a final, shared moment with her captor-turned-husband. She was leaving after all. What harm could a few seeds do? Her mother had always warned her, a strange half-forgotten rule from childhood. Never ever eat the food of the dead. But that was a folktale, wasn't it? A story to frighten children. This was reality. She was a goddess, a queen. She was leaving. Pluto watched her, his dark eyes betraying nothing. He knew the ancient laws, the primordial rules that bound even the gods themselves. A law that stated that anyone who tasted the fruit of the underworld was bound to it, forever. It was not a law he had created, but one he was sworn to uphold. It was the ultimate loophole. He could not hold her by force against Jupiter's command, but the laws of fate, they were another matter entirely. Hesitantly, Proserpina reached out. She took the pomegranate in her hand. It felt cool and heavy, a world away from the golden wheat and warm bread of her mother's table. She looked at Pluto one last time, then at the expectant face of Mercury, a symbol of the bright world awaiting her. And then she lifted the fruit to her lips. She carefully plucked a single ruby-red seed and placed it in her mouth. The taste was indescribable. It was sweet yet tart, with an earthy metallic undertone, like wine and rich soil and blood all at once. It tasted of secrets and of endings. It tasted of the underworld. She ate another, and then another. In total, she swallowed 6 seeds. 6 tiny, glistening pieces of fruit. Each one a link in an unbreakable chain. Each one a seal on a contract she never knew she was signing. In that moment, with that simple act, she bound her fate not just to the world of light, but to the world of shadow forever. The taste was sweet, a burst of tartness on her tongue, a momentary relief from the dust and shadow of the underworld. But as the last seed was swallowed, a strange coldness seeped into her bones, a feeling entirely different from the chill of the cavernous halls. It was a coldness of permanence, of a lock turning in a door she hadn't even seen. Pluto watched her, his expression unreadable, a sculpture of patient shadow. He had offered the fruit not as a jailer, but as a host. He had not forced her. He had merely presented an option. And in her hunger, in her longing for a taste of the world she knew, she had chosen. She had no idea that the laws of the underworld were as old and as unyielding as the rock that formed its foundations. One such law, whispered into existence by the fates themselves at the dawn of time, was absolute. Whoever consumes the food of the dead may never fully leave the land of the dead. It was a rule designed to keep the shades from returning, a one-way gate for the soul. But it applied to all mortal and divine. Just as this chilling realization began to dawn on her, a new light pierced the gloom. Not the fiery glow of the phlegathon, but a brilliant golden light that heralded the arrival of a god from the world above. It was Mercury, messenger of the gods, his winged sandals barely touching the scorched earth. He moved with a speed that defied the oppressive stillness of the realm, a living sunbeam in a land of eternal twilight. He carried the decree of Jupiter himself, the king of the gods. Moved by the plight of humanity and the unrelenting grief of Ceres, had commanded Pluto to release his bride. Hope, pure and overwhelming, surged through Proserpina. It was over. Her ordeal was over. She could go home. Pluto received the messenger with the solemn grace of a king. He listened to the command of his brother, his head inclined, showing no sign of protest. He agreed. Proserpina could go. His voice was even calm, betraying no emotion. He turned his gaze to his queen, and for the first time, she saw something akin to pity in his dark eyes. "Before you depart," he said, his voice echoing softly in the great hall, "tell me, my queen, have you taken any sustenance in my kingdom? Have you eaten anything at all?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Proserpina looked from Mercury's expectant face to Pluto's knowing one. The pomegranate, the 6 tiny jewel-like seeds. It was such a small thing, a simple snack. She hesitated, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Why did he ask? What did it matter? With a trembling voice, she admitted it. Yes, she had been hungry. She had eaten 6 seeds from a pomegranate. Mercury's radiant expression fell. The light around him seemed to dim. He knew the ancient law. Every god knew it. It was woven into the fabric of the cosmos. Pluto's face remained a mask, but a silent, unassailable victory settled around him. He hadn't broken Jupiter's command. He had agreed to let her go. But the fates, they had other plans. The law was the law. It was older than any of them, older than Olympus itself. It could not be unwritten. Proserpina had partaken of the fruit of the underworld. She was now a part of it. Bound. The journey back to the surface was a strange and silent procession. Proserpina rode in a chariot of black iron, guided by Mercury, ascending from the darkness into a world she wasn't sure she fully belonged to anymore. With every foot they climbed, the air grew warmer, the light grew stronger, but the cold knot of dread in her heart only tightened. What would she tell her mother? How could she explain that in a single moment of weakness, she had compromised the very freedom her mother had fought so hard to win? As they broke through to the surface, the world was waiting. The moment Proserpina's foot touched the soil of the living, a wave of warmth and life spread out from her. The frost on the trees began to melt. Tiny green shoots, brave and hopeful, pushed their way through the hardened earth. The birds, long silent, began to sing tentative melodies. The world, sensing the return of its maiden of spring, began to wake from its long, agonizing slumber. And then she saw her, Ceres, standing in a barren field, her form a study in grief, her hair like tangled straw, her face etched with sorrow. But as her eyes fell upon her daughter, a light returned to them that outshone the sun. A cry of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her lips, a sound that cracked the very ice on the mountains. She ran, her divine strength returning in a flood, and wrapped her daughter in an embrace that promised to never let go. For a moment all was forgotten. The abduction, the sorrow, the dying world. There was only a mother and her child, reunited against all odds. The world rejoiced with them, bursting forth in a riot of color and life. Spring had returned, but after the tears of joy came the questions. Ceres, holding her daughter's face in her hands, her eyes searching, asked the same question Pluto had, though for entirely different reasons. "Tell me truly, my child," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Did you eat anything while you were in that dreadful place? Did you taste the food of the dead?" Proserpina couldn't lie. Looking into her mother's hopeful eyes, her heart broke. The truth felt like a betrayal, a dagger to the heart of this perfect, beautiful reunion. With tears streaming down her own face, she confessed. The hunger, the beautiful, tempting fruit, the 6 small seeds. The transformation in Ceres was terrifying to behold. The joy on her face vanished, replaced by a look of utter horror, which then curdled into a rage so profound it made her previous sorrow seem like a passing shadow. The warmth that had been spreading across the land instantly receded. A new, far more bitter cold slammed down upon the world. The newly bloomed flowers blackened and withered on their stems. The green shoots retracted into the earth as if they had never been. The birdsong died in the air, replaced by a howling wind that carried not just cold but despair. Ceres' hope had been restored, only to be ripped away again. And this time her grief was not passive, it was a weapon. She turned her face to the heavens, to the peak of Mount Olympus, and she let out a roar of fury that shook the foundations of the world. This was not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. She would not be tricked. She would not accept this half-victory. If her daughter was to be bound to the underworld by some ancient, cruel law, then the world of the living would share that fate. Nothing would grow. Not a single stalk of wheat, not a single blade of grass. The fires in the hearts of humanity would die out, and the race of mortals that Jupiter so favored would starve in a world of ice and dust. She would turn the entire planet into a tomb, a mirror of the realm that had stolen her child. The crisis had escalated beyond a family dispute. This was now a threat to the cosmic order. The very survival of humanity was on the line. And so, the case was brought before the ultimate arbiter. Jupiter, king of gods and men, seated on his throne on Olympus. On one side stood Ceres, radiating an aura of cold fury, her presence freezing the very air of the divine court. On the other, summoned from his realm, stood Pluto, impassive and resolute, a king defending his claim, his queen, and the ancient laws he was bound to uphold. Between them, a silent, weeping Proserpina, the cause and prize of this cosmic struggle. The gods of Olympus gathered, their immortal faces grim. They knew this was no simple judgment. Jupiter was trapped. If he sided with Ceres and broke the ancient law, he would undermine the very structure of the universe and declare war on his own brother. If he sided with Pluto and upheld the law, he would condemn the world to an eternity of winter and allow his sister's grief to annihilate all mortal life. The fate of the world, the future of the seasons, and the destiny of a goddess all rested on his decision. He looked down at his sister, his brother and his niece, the weight of all creation settling upon his shoulders. Jupiter, the king of gods and men, felt the chill of the dying world seep into the very marble of Olympus. He saw the cosmic chessboard before him, and every possible move led to ruin. If he sided with his sister Ceres and forced Pluto's hand, he would break his own sacred vow and declare war on his brother, a conflict that could shatter the foundations of the universe. The underworld was Pluto's domain, absolute and inviolable. To breach it would be an act of tyranny, undermining the very order he was sworn to protect. But if he sided with his brother Pluto, allowing the marriage to stand, he would be condemning the world above to a permanent winter. Ceres would never yield. Her grief was now an elemental force, a power as potent as his own lightning. The crops would never grow. The rivers would freeze solid, and humanity, the fleeting fragile creation the gods so often toyed with, would perish in a shroud of ice and starvation. The king of the gods was trapped. He was bound by an oath to one brother and a blood tie to another. He was a ruler facing a rebellion from one of his most powerful subjects, and a father figure watching a family tear itself and the world apart. He couldn't command the fates, and he couldn't command a mother's love. What does a king do when every choice is the wrong one? He looks for a third path, a compromise, a loophole. He needed a diplomat, a messenger who could traverse the impossible distance between the sunlit world and the land of no return. He needed someone who could speak with the silver tongue of persuasion, not the iron fist of authority. He called for Mercury. The winged messenger, the god of travelers, merchants, and thieves, arrived in a blur of motion. He listened as Jupiter laid out the impossible task. He was not to command Pluto, but to persuade him. He was to appeal to his brother's reason, to his sense of duty. He was to paint a picture of the devastation above, of the silence falling across the mortal realm. He was to remind Pluto that a king with no living subjects is a king of nothing. Mercury's mission was not to rescue Proserpina, but to broker a peace that could save the world. With a nod, he fastened his winged sandals, grasped his caduceus, and leaped from the heights of Olympus. He flew faster than the dying light, crossing the threshold between life and death. The air grew cold and thin, the vibrant colors of the world muted to shades of gray. He descended past the river Styx, where the silent ferryman Charon pulled his boat of whispering souls. He saw the ghosts of heroes and kings, their earthly glories forgotten, now just formless shades in an eternal twilight. He passed the three-headed guardian, Cerberus, who knew the scent of a living god and let him pass with a low, guttural growl. The underworld was a place of profound silence, a kingdom built on memory and loss, and at its heart sat the obsidian palace of Pluto. Mercury entered the great hall, his vibrant, living presence a stark contrast to the somber grandeur. There on a throne of polished jet sat Pluto, the grim king, his face a mask of unyielding authority. And beside him, on a throne of her own, sat Proserpina. She was no longer the terrified girl who was dragged into the darkness. In her time there, a different kind of strength had taken root. She wore the darkness not as a shroud, but as a royal mantle. She had brought a strange, quiet beauty to the realm of the dead, her presence a flicker of warmth in the eternal cold. She had learned the names of the rivers of the underworld, the laws that governed the shades, and the secrets that lay buried deeper than any grave. She was a queen. Mercury bowed, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. He spoke of Jupiter's will, but he framed it as a plea. He described the world above, not with the anger of a god, but with the sadness of a witness. He spoke of Ceres, her hair turned white with grief, her tears freezing on the barren soil. He spoke of the dying mortals, their prayers to the gods going unanswered. He spoke of the imbalance, the cosmic order thrown into chaos. "The world above is dying," Mercury said, his words soft but heavy with truth, "and its fate rests with you. Jupiter does not command. He asks, let Proserpina return to the light, and let the world live again." Pluto listened, his expression unreadable. He looked at Proserpina, and for the first time, Mercury saw something other than grim majesty in the dark king's eyes. He saw a profound, aching love. He had spent eternity in solitude, the lord of a silent, colorless kingdom. Proserpina was the first flower to ever bloom in his desolate garden. She was the first song in a world of silence. To let her go was to return to that crushing loneliness. It was to have the one thing he had ever truly wanted torn away from him. And yet he was a king. He understood duty. He understood the balance of the cosmos. He knew that the death of the world above would eventually mean the end of his own kingdom, for there would be no new souls to join the ranks of the dead. He turned to Proserpina, his voice softer than Mercury had ever heard it. "You have heard the messenger," he said. "Your mother weeps for you. The world withers without you. You are free to go." The words hung in the air, a sacrifice of unimaginable weight. Proserpina looked from Pluto to Mercury, her heart a whirlwind of conflict. She missed her mother, the warmth of the sun, the scent of wildflowers. But a part of her had found a home here, in the quiet majesty of the underworld. She had found power, purpose. She was not just the daughter of Ceres anymore. She was the queen of this vast, mysterious domain. To leave was to abandon a part of herself. Pluto saw the conflict in her eyes. And in that moment, the lord of the underworld, the master of all that is hidden and secret, made a final subtle move. It was a move born of love but also of cunning. "Before you leave," he said, his voice gentle, "you must be hungry from your long ordeal. Share one last taste of my kingdom with me, a small token to remember your time here." He gestured, and a servant brought forth a pomegranate, its skin like burnished leather, its color a deep blood red. It was the only fruit that grew in the dark orchards of the underworld. Seemed like such a simple gesture, an act of kindness before a long farewell. Proserpina, lost in her thoughts, her emotions torn between two worlds, saw no harm in it. She was thirsty. She took the fruit. Pluto broke it open, revealing the glistening jewel-like seeds within, each one a tiny drop of captured twilight. He offered them to her. She looked at him, at the sadness in his eyes, and felt a pang of sympathy, of connection. She took a small handful of the seeds. It was an innocent act, a bite of fruit, but in the realm of the gods, nothing is ever simple. There are ancient laws, rules of hospitality and consumption that are older than Olympus itself. One of these laws was absolute. Anyone who eats the food of the underworld is forever bound to it. They can never fully leave. She put the seeds in her mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The taste was sweet, but with a dark earthy undertone, a flavor unlike anything that grew under the sun. It was the taste of secrets, of shadows, of eternity. As the last seed was swallowed, a faint, invisible chain settled around her soul, tying her not as a prisoner, but as a permanent resident of the realm she had just agreed to leave. Pluto's face remained a mask of sorrow, but deep within his shadowed heart, a grim victory had been won. He had not defied Jupiter. He had not held his queen by force. He had simply offered her a gift, and she had accepted. Proserpina, unaware of the cosmic contract she had just signed, prepared to ascend with Mercury, believing she was returning to her old life, not realizing that her fate, and the fate of the world itself, had just been irrevocably sealed by 6 tiny seeds. The journey back to the world of the living was a strange and silent ascent. Mercury, the divine messenger, led the way, his winged sandals barely whispering against the ethereal path that spiraled upwards from the depths. Proserpina followed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every step was a step away from the gloom, away from the silent king and his shadowy court, and a step closer to the sun, to the scent of rain-soaked earth, to her mother. The darkness of the underworld receded behind her, not like a closing door, but like a memory that was already beginning to feel distant, almost dreamlike. She thought of Pluto, of his quiet intensity, the unexpected gentleness in his gaze, but she pushed the thoughts away. She was going home. That was all that mattered. As they neared the surface, a faint light began to pierce the gloom, and with it came a sound she hadn't realized she'd missed so desperately. It was the sound of life, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the low hum of a world reawakening. And then she saw her. Ceres stood at the mouth of the cavern from which they emerged, a silhouette against a sky that was just beginning to clear. The goddess looked older, worn down by a grief so profound it had carved new lines into her immortal face. But as her eyes fell upon Proserpina, a light ignited within her, a radiant joy that seemed to physically push back the lingering winter clouds. The reunion was not one of words, but of pure, unbridled emotion. Ceres ran, her divine grace forgotten in a frantic maternal charge. She enveloped Proserpina in an embrace so powerful it felt as though she was trying to merge their two forms back into one. To undo the separation that had caused so much pain. Tears streamed down her face, but these were not the tears of sorrow that had frozen the world. They were tears of relief, of a love so fierce it could melt glaciers. And as they clung to each other, the world responded. The frozen ground softened beneath their feet. Dormant seeds, feeling the warmth of Ceres' joy, began to stir. A tentative green shoot pushed its way through the thawing soil. The sun, as if given permission, broke through the clouds in a brilliant golden wave. The long winter was over. Life was returning. For a time there was only joy. Ceres held her daughter's face in her hands, tracing every feature as if to be certain she was real. She peppered her with questions. Was she hurt? Was she well? Had Pluto been cruel? Proserpina, caught up in the overwhelming tide of her mother's love, and the sheer relief of freedom, reassured her. She was safe. She was unharmed. She was home. The world bloomed around them in a riot of color and life, a direct reflection of Ceres' happiness. The rivers flowed freely, the trees burst into leaf, and the air filled with the scent of blossoms. It was a perfect, beautiful moment, a fragile, fleeting illusion. As the initial ecstasy began to subside, a shadow of divine caution crept into Ceres' mind. She knew the ancient laws. She knew the ways of the fates, whose threads were woven into the fabric of reality itself, binding even the gods. She pulled back slightly, her gaze searching, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a desperate hope that she was wrong. "My child," she began, her hands tightening on Proserpina's arms. "Tell me truly, did you consume any food while you were in that dark place? Did anything pass your lips in the realm of the dead?" The question hung in the air, suddenly colder than the winter they had just escaped. Proserpina's heart sank. The memory, which had seemed so insignificant just moments before, now felt like a lead weight in her stomach. The image of Pluto, his dark eyes watching her, the glistening red jewels of the pomegranate in his hand, the sweet, sharp taste of the 6 seeds. She was a goddess, but she could not lie about a thing of such cosmic importance. Her silence was answer enough, but Ceres needed to hear the words. "Tell me, Proserpina. Tell me everything." Hesitantly, her voice barely audible, Proserpina confessed. Only a little, mother. He was kind. He offered me a pomegranate. I was hungry and I ate. Just 6 seeds. That is all. 6 seeds. 6 tiny, insignificant kernels. But in that moment, they were heavier than all the mountains of the earth. The light in Ceres' eyes died. The joy that had resurrected the world curdled into a black, terrifying fury. The nascent spring recoiled as if struck by a physical blow. A cold wind whipped through the newly bloomed flowers, tearing their petals from them. The sun, which had shone so brightly, was instantly choked by a thick gray blanket of cloud. "No!" Ceres breathed, the word a ragged, broken thing. Then her voice rose into a scream of pure anguish and rage that shook the very foundations of the world. "No! What have you done?" The warmth fled the earth. The green shoots withered and blackened. The rivers began to slow, the chill of ice creeping back into their currents. Ceres' grief, once a passive, world-ending sorrow, was now an active, destructive rage. She was not just letting the world die. She was now commanding it to. This was not a negotiation. It was a threat. If the laws of the fates meant her daughter was bound to the underworld, then she would see to it that there was no world left for the fates to govern. Humanity, caught in the crossfire of this divine tragedy, would starve. The gods of Olympus would preside over a barren rock. The situation had escalated beyond a simple kidnapping. It was now an existential threat to the entire cosmic order. And so Jupiter, king of the gods, was forced to intervene once more. But this time it wasn't about sending a messenger. It was about rendering a final binding judgment. He descended from Olympus, his presence a calming, immense pressure on the raging elements. He stood before the furious mother, the terrified daughter, and the silent messenger. He listened to Ceres' rage, her accusations, her vow to let all of creation perish. He listened to Proserpina's quiet, tearful confession. He knew the law. It was absolute. Anyone who tasted the food of the underworld was bound to it. The fates themselves had decreed it at the dawn of time. Not even he, the sovereign of the heavens, could unwrite it. To do so would be to unravel reality itself. Pluto had not broken any divine law. He had simply enforced it. But Jupiter also saw the truth in Ceres' threat. Her power over the earth was absolute, and her grief was a weapon capable of destroying them all. A direct confrontation was impossible. A simple ruling was insufficient. The cosmos itself teetered on a knife's edge, demanding a solution that honored the ancient laws while preventing total annihilation. And so Jupiter, in his wisdom, brokered a compromise. It was a piece of cosmic legislation that would forever alter the rhythm of life on Earth. He turned his gaze to Proserpina, the girl who was now a queen, the innocent maiden who now held a dark kingdom in her heart. "You ate 6 seeds," he declared, his voice echoing with the authority of creation. "There are 12 months in the year. The law cannot be broken, but it can be balanced." The decree was set. For every seed she had eaten, Proserpina would spend 1 month in the underworld as its rightful queen, beside her husband, Pluto. For 6 months of the year, she would belong to the realm of the dead. But for the remaining 6 months, she would be free to return to the world above, to walk in the sun and live in the light with her mother Ceres. It was not the perfect victory Ceres had craved, but it was not the total loss she had feared. Her rage subsided, replaced by a deep, melancholic acceptance. She would have her daughter back, but only for a time. Her joy would always be temporary, her sorrow always waiting on the horizon, and the world would be bound to her emotions forever. When Proserpina descended into the earth to take her throne beside Pluto, Ceres would mourn. Her grief would strip the leaves from the trees, cover the land in a blanket of snow and frost, and send all life into a deep slumber. This would be the time of fall and winter. But when the 6 months were past, and Proserpina rose once more from the darkness, Ceres' joy would be so profound that she would coax the world back to life. The flowers would bloom, the fields would grow heavy with grain, and the sun would warm the land. This would be the time of spring and summer. The great cyclical engine of the seasons was born from a goddess's love and a goddess's sorrow. Proserpina was no longer just the daughter of the harvest. She was now a bridge between 2 worlds, the harbinger of both life and death, her fate forever divided, her heart forever torn between the brilliant light of the sun and the solemn majesty of the dark. And in that division a new cosmic rhythm was born. The world, which had known only endless summer under Ceres' benevolent gaze, now learned the language of cycles, of change, of seasons. When Proserpina ascended from the shadows, bursting forth into the world of light, the earth itself erupted in celebration. Her first steps on the soil were a command to life. Dormant seeds stirred, flowers unfurled in a riot of color, and the trees, once skeletal and barren, cloaked themselves in vibrant green. The air grew warm, filled with the hum of bees and the songs of birds returning. It was spring, and as she walked the land with her mother, their reunion a source of pure, unbridled joy. The sun burned brighter, the days grew longer, and the fields swelled with golden grain. It was the abundance of summer, a testament to a mother's love made manifest in the bounty of the earth. But this joy was always temporary, always tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of its end. As the time for her return to the underworld drew near, a shadow would begin to fall, not just on Ceres' heart, but on the world itself. The leaves on the trees, as if sensing the coming sorrow, would blush with the colors of fire and gold before letting go, drifting to the ground in a final, beautiful surrender. The air would grow crisp, the vibrant greens fading to muted browns. This was autumn, the world's long melancholic sigh. And when Proserpina finally descended, crossing the threshold back into her husband's kingdom, her mother's grief would become absolute. Ceres would withdraw her blessing from the earth, wrapping herself in a shroud of sorrow. The world would fall silent under a blanket of snow and ice. The winds would howl, and the land would sleep a cold, hard sleep. It was winter, a world grieving for its absent queen of spring. This eternal cycle became the fundamental law of nature, a story told not in words, but in the turning of the earth itself. The myth of Pluto and Proserpina was no longer just a tale of the gods. It was the explanation for life itself, for its constant dance between flourishing and decay, presence and absence. It gave the Romans a framework to understand why the world bloomed and why it withered, linking the most intimate human emotions of love, loss, and reunion to the grand, impersonal mechanics of the cosmos. But what of Proserpina's time in the underworld? Was it 6 months of pure misery, a sentence to be endured? The Roman interpretation suggests something far more complex and far more profound. She was not merely a visitor or a prisoner. She was a queen, In the world above, she was the daughter of Ceres, the embodiment of spring's gentle promise. But in the world below, she came into her own power. She was the formidable, respected, and even feared ruler of the underworld, standing equal to Pluto himself. She was the mistress of secrets, the keeper of the final rest, the one who greeted the shades of the dead. This duality is the very heart of her transformation. The maiden who once chased butterflies in sunlit fields became a sovereign who commanded the legions of the dead. She learned the geography of darkness, the names of the ancient specters, and the laws that govern the final passage. She brought a different kind of life to a lifeless place, not the life of blooming flowers, but the life of order, of dignity, of purpose. She tempered Pluto's grim severity with a solemn grace. It was Proserpina who would hear the pleas of heroes who ventured into the dark, like Orpheus, and it was her heart that could be moved to compassion, a flicker of light in the unending gloom. She did not just rule the underworld, she completed it. She became its soul, just as Pluto was its will. And in this, we see a crucial evolution from the Greek Persephone. While Persephone often remained a figure of sorrow and victimhood, the Roman Proserpina embodies a powerful sense of duty, that quintessential Roman virtue, gravitas. She accepted her fate and from it, forged a new identity, a new power. She became the bridge, the only being who could truly understand the nature of both existence and non-existence. She knew the warmth of the sun and the cold finality of the tomb. She understood the joy of creation and the necessity of conclusion. This unique wisdom made her one of the most revered and complex goddesses in the Roman pantheon. The story's influence seeped into the very fabric of Roman spiritual life, most notably through the mystery cults. For the average Roman, the official state religion offered civic order and divine favor, but it offered little comfort in the face of personal mortality. The underworld of Pluto was a gray, grim, and permanent destination. But the story of Proserpina, of her descent and crucially her return, offered a tantalizing glimmer of hope. It was a divine precedent. If she could travel between the worlds of the living and the dead, might there be a path for mortals too? Mystery cults, like the rites of Eleusis which the Romans adopted, centered on this very idea. Through secret rituals, initiations, and symbolic reenactments of Proserpina's abduction and return, followers believed they could secure for themselves a more blessed afterlife, escaping the bleak eternity of the ordinary shade. Proserpina became a savior figure, a psychopomp who not only guided the dead, but held the key to a better existence beyond the veil. Her story was no longer just about the seasons, it was about the salvation of the human soul. This profound narrative has echoed through the millennia, refusing to fade. It has haunted the dreams of poets and painters, a timeless allegory for the most fundamental aspects of the human condition. Think of Bernini's breathtaking sculpture, The Rape of Proserpina. In a single block of marble, he captures the entire conflict, Pluto's raw, divine power, his fingers sinking into her flesh, and Proserpina's desperate, twisting struggle, a tear of pure anguish carved onto her cheek. It is a moment of violent transition, the terrifying threshold between innocence and experience, light and dark, frozen in stone for all time. Countless other works, from pre-Raphaelite paintings to modern poetry, have revisited this myth, each generation finding new meaning in its ancient bones. Because when we strip away the gods and the mythology, what are we left with? We are left with a story about ourselves. Proserpina's journey is the human journey. We all begin in the sunlit fields of innocence, in a world protected by a mother's love, a world of simplicity and light. But life inevitably intervenes. There is always a Pluto, a force that pulls us away from that world. It might be grief, it might be heartbreak, it might be failure. It might be the simple, brutal transition into the responsibilities of adulthood. We are all, at some point, abducted into our own personal underworld. And in that darkness, we are forced to confront a different part of ourselves. We eat the pomegranate seeds. We make choices, sometimes unknowingly, that bind us to this new, more complicated reality. We cannot go back to being the person we were. The innocence once lost can never be fully reclaimed. But this is not a tragedy. It is the beginning of wisdom. It is in the underworld of our lives, in the moments of our deepest struggles, that we, like Proserpina, discover our own sovereignty. We find a strength we never knew we possessed. We learn to rule in the darkness, to navigate our own shadows, to find a strange and solemn beauty in the depths. And then, if we are fortunate, we re-emerge. We return to the light, but we are not the same. We carry the wisdom of the darkness with us. We appreciate the sun more because we have known its absence. We love more deeply because we understand the reality of loss. We live more fully because we have an intimate knowledge of the alternative. We learn to live in the cycle just as she did. We have our seasons of joy and our seasons of sorrow, and we learn that one gives meaning to the other. The myth of Pluto and Proserpina endures not because it explains winter, but because it explains us. It is a timeless recognition that human life is not meant to be lived solely in the light. Wholeness is not the absence of darkness, but the integration of it. True strength is not about avoiding the underworld, but about learning how to reign there. Proserpina, the girl who was stolen, became the queen who chose to return, who chose to embrace her dual nature. She teaches us that our scars are the source of our power, that our grief can be the seed of our wisdom, and that it is only by embracing the fullness of our own divided heart, the brilliant light and the solemn dark, that we can truly, finally become complete.